afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to Modern Crises, Ancient Gods. For much of human history, nature was our god. We worshipped the sun, the moon, and later in Northern Europe, tree gods. Human gods sort of followed them, and then science arrived, and it seemed to sweep all of our gods away. Yet now science and technology have perceived that where once we used to think they tamed nature, they're increasingly seen as plundering the planet, wrecking the climate. And at least in some quarters, gods are back in fashion. So were the ancients right? Is nature the source of all things and that which we should cherish most closely? Or should we build a whole way of life or even a theology of nature with that at its heart? To help us discuss this, we have David King. Sir David King was the former Chief Scientific Advisor for both Blair and Brown and Foreign Secretary's Special Representative for Climate Change. To my left, we have Natalie Bennett, former Green Party leader, newly appointed Baroness in Theresa May's honours list, making her the second Green Party peer. And on the extreme left, we have Sister Jayanti, European Director of Brahma Kumaris, their representative at the United Nations, and a key presenter at the COP climate change conferences. Were the ancients right? Is nature the source of all things, and should nature be what we guard most closely? David, would you give us 3 minutes?
In the Greek world, the seas could suddenly storm up and people would be drowned, and it was obvious that the gods were doing this. And what you had to do was make sacrifices to the gods in order to try and appease them before making a major journey. But we have been on a triumphant march since that period through the advancement of science, medicine, sociology, engineering, providing us with an unprecedented level of human betterment and well-being. One of the measures of this is that children live to maturity. Here in Britain, if a woman had 7 children, which was an average for hundreds of years, only 2 survived into maturity. Now they're all surviving into maturity, they all have children, and so the population of the planet is approaching 8 billion and will be 10 billion. And so we have been providing the energy we need by burning fossil fuels, we've been providing food we need by taking out forests. Over all of this period of time, we have spread our mode of living across the whole earth, and that whole earth is becoming scorched by this process. We have, in other words, not put a value on the natural world. It is only by attempting to understand how we lost the sense of the essence of the earth that we can rebuild our mode of living to protect the only means of sustaining ourselves. Yes, we have to do what we can to deal with climate change, but let's bear in mind this critically important message.
Thank you. Natalie, were the ancients right?
We have understood so little. We have science as being this giant lion stalking around, and it's immensely powerful and immensely strong. But, maybe it steps on a thorn in the forest, and maybe there's a bacteria on that thorn, and maybe, the lion has antibiotics, but because we've been spraying antibiotics around like they're confetti, that bacteria has developed resistance to the antibiotics, and the bacteria fells the lion. But if we're going to have a new god or a new way of thinking, we have to learn from the ancients. The Italians in the 1920s had a proverb when artificial fertilizers first came in. Fertilizer is good for the father and bad for the son. They mightn't have understood the microbial and fungicidal systems, but there was a traditional knowledge that looked at what fertilizer was doing and saying this is damaging the traditional systems of fertilizing plants. So we need to look to lots of traditional knowledge, lots of traditional understandings. We need to think about sociology. We need to think about economics. So I've got a suggestion for a god, if you like. What we need is systems thinking. We need to bring together knowledge from lots of different fields, not think a narrow scientific approach has all the answers. Think that the past has some of the answers too. And if you want to say, how do we bring in systems thinking, my answer is Sustainable Development Goals. They're far from perfect, but they're a start. So, I don't expect to see it any time soon, but what I want to see, at least metaphorically, is a giant march down Whitehall, chanting, what do we want? Systems thinking. When do we want it? Now.
Sister Jayanti, what do you think? Were the ancients right? Should we value nature above all?
Thank you for this opportunity. I have to say that spirituality only came into the conscious realm of the environment activists just a very short while ago. That's not to say that spirituality didn't have thoughts about it earlier. I myself have been connected with the Earth Charter, which was being created in the 80s at the UN in Geneva. And so from that time on, there has been a spiritual perspective. And when we started talking about consciousness and climate change, it was a shock to people. What does that have to do with anything? But actually, it's our consciousness that determines our vision, our attitude, and everything we do in relationship with the world around us and with people around us. And so nature is absolutely something that we can deal with only when we understand what's happening within our consciousness. And spirituality says, whatever is my awareness, that's going to be my attitude to the world around me. And so when I have the awareness of my own inner being as a spiritual being, not just bones and flesh, but when I know who I am, then I treat myself with respect, but I treat nature and its generosity and its abundance with a huge amount of love and respect. And so the perfect balance between self and nature is one of respect and love. Nature has given, and I love nature and give back to nature my respect. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to pick up on that. When we're all talking about nature, what do we mean by it? Because you've each sort of picked out something about nature. I wonder if this comes to you first, Natalie. You talked about nature not being inert. So when we talk about nature, what should we think about? Is it just something passive? Is it something that's not inert? And how do we fit into it?
Well, I think, to begin with, we could have a whole debate, and I don't want to go down this route because I don't think it's particularly fruitful, but of course we are all part of nature. The plastic chair you're sitting on has been created by human beings, which are natural. And on the other way of looking this round, there is no such thing as a natural place left in the world. The depths of the Mariana Trench, the deepest bit of the ocean, the part that would seem most immune to human beings, is actually full of PCBs and other noxious chemicals. It's full of plastic. Humans have had an impact on every single inch of this earth. Every single bit of soil humans have had an impact on. But of course we are also part of nature. So understanding that interaction, coming back to what I said about systems, the whole thing is one system. We are part of that system. And there are some fairly negative, and not the way I'd go about this, reports of saying, you can look at us as a species that's just wildly overrun. And if you look, there are plenty of examples of that from biology, and we know where that goes to. What is different about us is we have the kind of consciousness that Sister Jayanti was talking about. And we can think about the impact we're having, and that is something unique. So far as we know, no other species on the planet has done that. So we can think about what we're doing. And that gives us a huge responsibility and a huge opportunity. And I think if we look at nature and the impact of nature, and again, this picks up something Sister Jayanti said, one individual animal almost never in nature has a massive impact. It's a species or a population that has an impact. And so, we need to think as human beings as our impact and how we can work together to change the way we interact with all the other parts of nature, but we are part of that nature too.
David, what?
I think I was put on this panel as the scientist as opposed to Sister Jayanti. I am very close to what she said, and if you like, I'm therefore quite spiritual. I certainly believe that some of the older religions, and I'm now moving away from Christianity and Judaism to Buddhism, to the Taoism in China, which in my sense are more philosophies than religions. And in those parts of the world, you'll find there is a continuing respect for the fact that we are a part of nature. Every Chinese student in school today is taught that you've got to have respect for every other living creature. There's a sense in which we are all part of the same thing. And what I was saying is we have come to regard nature as apart from ourselves, not a part of ourselves. And if just look up the Oxford English Dictionary, see what it says about nature. It's those parts of the world that have not been impacted on by human beings. You know, it's a crazy definition. So my feeling is that, and if I may say, I disagree rather more with Natalie, because Natalie is setting science up as the bad guy. Science is simply knowledge. I go back to the ancient Greek meaning of that word. It's knowledge, and knowledge is a good thing. We can't say that President Trump is a good thing, right? So the knowledge and truth are critically important. Where is the problem in my view? I think it is that our economic system, which is a free market system, deregulated, that has no respect for the natural world, and that's where all the critical problems are. I don't believe that system, which I have to admit has delivered human well-being across the world, I don't believe that system is fit for purpose in the 21st century. So here's a challenge. We're up against the capitalist system as it exists. How do we change that?
Are you saying that you are, in some sense, anti-capitalist, that you think that the capitalist system has run its course and is now toxic?
Economists are telling me, no, the free market system is okay, and the biggest free market failure is climate change. And I said, well, hold on. Climate change is about to create havoc to the entire planet for us and for other living creatures. I believe we've got 10 years to get this right, no more than that, and this means a massive exercise globally. Are we going to manage that under the present capitalist system as it is now? No. So do we have to change that system? I've got no doubt we do.
Natalie, did you want
Well, I just wanted to come back to David in terms of, I entirely agree with your economic approach, but just to say I'm criticising a particular sort of science, an arrogant science that says, okay, we understand a bit of chemistry, therefore we understand the soils. And what a lot of science over the past 3 or 4 decades and earlier failed to do was really ask the question, what don't we know? Said, hey, we know this, so we've answered everything. And there has been a culture within science that has failed to acknowledge how much we don't know.
I don't recognise that.
Well, this was the science I was taught in the 1980s in Australia. It was indeed like a religion. We have the facts, you learn the facts, you recite the facts in the exam, you go out and apply the facts. And that was the way science was taught to me. And it has the way science has existed in significant parts of the operation in universities.
Science has never been like that. If I'm a scientist and I'm sitting at the cutting edge of my science and I publish a paper, somebody else may well shoot me down, and what they've done is observe the world better than I had. Right? So we've always got the real world we're trying to describe. You cannot equate it to religion where you're pulling truth from somewhere else. Right? It is the real world scientists are describing. I simply don't recognize that.
Well, it sort of moves us on to the second theme, which is this notion of, should we harness nature for our benefit, or should we revere it for itself? And Natalie I don't think she got this impression from nowhere. And so is there a difference between the kind of ideal science you're talking about and the kind of science where Monsanto says, glyphosate's great, trust us, spray it everywhere? And then later we go, oh, maybe not.
Let me take as an example the case of antibiotics. There is something that has given human well-being a tremendous boost. So massive scientific advance measured in terms of human well-being. In the United States, most beef is produced in Colorado in beef factories, 90% of the beef. The calves are fed with alfalfa, but also with antibiotics and growth hormones. In 9 months, they grow to full size, whereas it would take 9 years. And this is then fed to human beings. And you're wondering why Americans are bigger than others. The point I'm going to make now is, it's that behavior which is harnessing the economic system in the United States. It's that use of science that is destroying the utility of science. Antibiotics, as a result of what the Americans are doing, will become non-viable. They will no longer function. So I think what I'm saying is, the science is there. The people who use the science are the people who have to be, if you like, managed so that we manage respect towards the natural world.
Okay, but I mean, it sounds as if you're saying, look, the science are pure and wonderful creatures who just in search of the truth, and then some corporate person comes along and perverts the whole thing. But there are a lot of scientists who work for those corporations, and so do the scientists have some responsibility to say, actually, Mr. Monsanto, I'm not going to do that work for you, and you're misrepresenting my science?
The last thing I would ever say is that there are no bad scientists. There are as many bad scientists as there are bad human beings.
Fine.
And so you can work for Monsanto and explain to everyone that Monsanto is good for the world. What all you're doing is selling Monsanto products.
Right.
We all know that. Yeah.
Sure. Well, I mean, Sister Jayanti, I mean, is there a sense in which then that kind of, I know I'm picking them out, but corporate science is somehow at least spiritually failing, if not morally failing?
In fact, it's not just one part of humanity that's to blame, in a sense. We're picking on the scientists now.
Yes.
But in fact, if you look at what's going on, it's the shift of consciousness from a spiritual identity in which I relate to myself as that inner being, and I see each and every one of you as part of my family, seeing you as spiritual beings also, without getting distracted by gender or color or race or age or any of those things. And what happens is, when I associate my identity with a physical form, this is matter in a certain sense, and so we get materialistic. From matter, our consciousness comes to materialism. From materialism, we become consumers, and where the problem lies is the consumer society. India was much more in touch with its soul, in a sense, and much more in touch with nature 30, 40 years ago. And today one would say India is developed, and I would challenge that very strongly. And what happens today is that today every single small town in India has a shopping mall. That didn't exist 40, 50, or even 30 years ago. It does today. So I don't think it's one part of humanity that's the cause. I think it's consumerism, materialism, where we've forgotten about our own inner values. When we connect with spirituality, we connect with our core values of peace, of love, of truth, of happiness. Today we connect all of these things with finding them outside, trying to find happiness out there, trying to find joy and peace out there. And it's not true, but this is then the whole advertising syndrome. Buy this product and you'll be happy forever. It's a joke, isn't it? But of course, it's part of the whole system of consumerism and materialism.
And I think it's interesting that you use the word system there, because I do want to come back to the argument for systems thinking here. And I think that I was listening to David talking about, oh yes, these bad scientists defending Monsanto or whatever. But of course you've had to be a really extraordinarily brave scientist to investigate and come out and publish a report against glyphosate. you've had to, the sociology of this, the economics of this, the practicality of this is you have this thought that maybe there's this negative impact. You do some experiments, but you have to be extraordinarily brave to publish that paper. Now that's the practical reality of the sociology of science, and we have to understand the sociology of science. And this is partly economic systems, but it's not only economic systems. If we think of another case study, which is where, this is 20 or so years ago now, people thought that ulcers were caused by stress and anxiety and bad diets. And there were a couple of scientists in Australia who thought actually this might be a bacterial infection. And there were some economic interests here, some manufacturers of antacids and stuff, but they weren't certainly as dominant as Monsanto is in terms of glyphosate. But they had to fight enormously hard because there was a scientific belief. We understand this, we know about this, we understand all of these systems. And to challenge those systems, particularly if you are, as you generally are, a junior scientist, challenging the senior professor, challenging a raft of senior professors, we need to understand the sociology, the challenge, the difficulties of that, and the way that institutions and structures, as well as economics, stand in the way of really understanding what's happening in the world.
I don't want to spend the whole time disagreeing with Natalie, but her description of science, I spent 45 years in research. That is nothing to do with the science that I experienced around the world while I was doing my research. In other words, if you were the maverick, you stood out, you published a paper, and it was different from everybody else, you stood out. And people might attack you, but do not believe that you would be prevented or ridiculed for publishing. And this person has now been recognized with a major prize. So the system will examine what you're saying critically, because it's very different from what is believed, but you are expected to do that as a scientist. And if you want to rise, as he did, above the rest, we all know you have to do that. So it's not the world of science that I know.
Can I just add?
Please, yeah.
Sometimes I've heard scientists say that, in fact, science doesn't get into the whole system of values and technology is separate, and that's then getting into the system of consumerism, etc. But in fact, every human being has values, and whether I'm a scientist or not a scientist, there should be the situation where it's my conscience connected with my values that guides me in my life. And because we've forgotten about spirituality and said, well, that's nothing to do with life, all of this, so then we've forgotten about values. And so we come to a state today where we don't have that same level of respect or compassion or humility or love anymore. And so I think, again, the big cry that I have is come back to knowing who you are. And then you find all those values within yourself. And then the label of that is spirituality.
Thank you. Which brings us, I suppose, to the third theme, which is we've talked about what's wrong, but if we're looking at a way forward, and as you said, you believe we have a decade to put things right, is the answer going to be relying on a spiritual transformation that sweeps the globe, or should we put our faith in? I'm gesturing towards you because you're the person we've nominated to carry this burden.
So I'm going to say,
is it science or is it politics? Is it a political solution?
It's not either or. We need all of the above.
Okay.
So I'm setting up the Centre for Climate Repair in Cambridge. Social scientists, sociologists, everyone is involved. It is engineers as well. Why is it engineers? We have to refreeze the poles. The Arctic Ocean is now exposed in the Arctic summer to sunlight. The Arctic region is now heating up at 2.5 times the rate of the rest of the planet, and Greenland, sitting there, is losing its ice. When it's all gone, sea levels will be 7 meters higher than they are today. That's what's already on the cards. So we have to refreeze the poles. Now, how do we do that? I've got a group of 20, 30 people around the world. We're discussing how we might do this. This is an engineering challenge. I believe we can do it. It's like landing a man on the moon, although I, at the time, thought that was a useless exercise. But nevertheless, Kennedy says to the Americans, we're going to land a man on the moon in 10 years' time. In the 1960s, that was one hell of a challenge, right? That was a really big challenge, and they managed it. And I think we can manage these challenges as well, but we need all the science and engineering that we have at our disposal. And then at the same time, as we move forward, we have to learn to return to our level of consciousness, our awareness of each other and what we are, that weightless thing that is consciousness. We have to return to examine that, because certainly in most of our competitive lives, we lose sight of it. And so I think we need both.
Can I just add one thing? I think I'm right in saying, when you say it's 7 meters, I think a large proportion, maybe even the bulk of the world's nuclear power stations are within 7 meters of the present sea level. And since it takes about a decade to even shut one down, that would certainly argue for what you're saying, that we really can't hang around.
Well,
I mean, if they start to flood,
but if I may say, it's a very pointed argument.
Yes,
right?
I'm just my job.
No, I am put forward as a nuclear salesman because when I was in government 18 years ago, I said I couldn't see how Britain could be net zero emissions without nuclear energy. I no longer believe that, and I saw nuclear energy as a last resort, but climate change is such a big challenge that I thought we even needed that last resort. So I think 7 meters sea level rise, 80% of the world's cities will no longer be livable. That's the real challenge, right? And what is the first big city to go under? And it's imminent, Calcutta. And across the water from Calcutta is Bangladesh, also going underwater. 160 million people looking for somewhere else to live. If that's not going to destabilize the planet, I don't know what.
I think it could be a bit of a problem. Natalie, as a politician, what are you going to do about this? Come on.
Well, I must admit I'm feeling much more comfortable now because I'm entirely agreeing with David in terms of what he's presenting is essentially what I call systems thinking, which is taking, I don't wish to down-cry science. I just think that science has to be accepted critically, and it has to be critical of itself in a way that it often hasn't been. But if you understand that problems have a sociological and economic, all of these dimensions, and we essentially have to change everything. And I think one of the things we have to recognise, and it kind of ties with my point thinking about nature, is that humans have impacted on every square inch of this whole planet. And we've damaged every square inch of this whole planet. And we have to think about, as Sister Jayanti said, treading much more lightly. And so this looks like and is an enormous challenge. But this is where perhaps what you might call the spiritual dimension would come in. I would perhaps call the well-being or quality of life dimension comes in. Because if we created a wonderful life for human beings while trashing the planet, then it would be really hard to say, well, we've got to take away this wonderful life because we've got to stop, we've got to protect nature. But actually, we have created a dreadfully unequal, stressed, insecure, desperate society around the world. And the fact that we've got to change for the purposes of nature is actually really good news for human well-being and existence. And that's where thinking about what is well-being, what is a good life, is really important part of this whole issue. And this is where thinking about what kind of balance in life is. I mean, one of the things that perhaps makes this really concrete and practical is there's a certain sort of politics, it seems to be associated with the theory that, well, I'm a politician and I get by on 4 hours sleep a night. Well, I get by on 3 hours sleep a night. Now, I have my first degrees biological science, and I know that to be a healthy, functioning organism, you need 7 to 8 hours sleep a night. And any politician who tells you that they're getting by on 3 or 4 hours sleep is either A, lying, or B, shouldn't be allowed anywhere near the levers of the country. And that, kind of ties all together, all of this thinking about that we have to think about our own biology, our own existence as a natural organism, but we've also got to think about the politics of this and why are people saying this and how does this all fit together?
Is our political system up to this? Because if we take a 10-year timeline, and most political parties and the political system takes 40 years just to agree that there is a problem, never mind doing anything about it. If Roger Hallam was here, I think he might be saying, look, if we put our faith in the gods of technology or old-fashioned gods or the gods of politicians, we're all sunk. We're going to have to look to ourselves and get out on the street. Does that work for you?
Very much so, because in that question, the word I'd focus on, does our political system work? And what do you mean by our? If you mean UK, well, I reckon I'd probably get about 100% agreement in this room that we have a broken political system that's utterly failed. That's easy. If, however, we look at, say, some of the Scandinavian countries, which not coincidentally are some of the countries that are doing best in terms of climate and treatment of nature and also better societies for people, less stressed, less unequal, they are the most democratic ones. So I would say I come back to whatever question you ask me. If you ask me about seaweed, somewhere I will eventually get back to saying the answer is democracy. And, this perhaps squares with what Sister Jayanti is saying is, people trusting in themselves, believing in themselves, being empowered in themselves. And what you have is, what I would say is the other side of politics, the far right that looks for, the great leader riding up on the white horse, leading the people to the new promised land. Or alternatively, you have a society where you say everyone's important, everyone can make a difference, everyone can make decisions about their own lives, their communities, their society. So yes, I think the answer is a political system, and that political system is democracy, and it's about time we made Britain one of them.
Okay. And that sounds great, but let's say they re-elect Trump. Do we have time? Should we just go, well, that was the choice?
I did a debate with an American philosopher who's suggesting we gave up on democracy because of Trump. And I said, well, that assumes that Trump has anything to do with democracy. The American political system is less of a democracy than the British political system is.
Of course,
so,
but it's still this political system, isn't it? So if we put our faith in your God, I'm making you the political God, is your political God, does he do great speeches but achieve bugger all?
Well, if it's one person, I would agree with your second characterisation. If it's all of the people collectively together, empowered and engaged with the time and energy to act, then yes, democracy can do it. All of the people together can do it.
Sister Jayanti, and then we'll come
My own sense is that what's happening within nature and climate change is a huge, huge wake-up call for all of us. To be able to look inwards and realize that whatever's going on inside is what's happening outside. In the sense that if at this moment we see that our minds are not in a state of harmony and order, but in a state of chaos, there's a tension between my conscience and my values, and so the struggle is going on within. So all of these struggles within are being reflected outside in our world, whether in politics or our relationship with nature. And so, plus we see whatever it is that's going on, it started from human consciousness, my thinking. And so I don't think it takes a long time to change the way we think. I just think that at this moment, because we're at such a crisis, I don't see an alternative. We have to shift our thinking to a spiritual consciousness so that then we can take charge of what's going on within ourselves and then express that which we know to be the highest so that our relationship with each other changes. Instead of division and chaos, it comes back to a state of harmony. And then our relationship with nature can also come back to harmony.
David?
We've heard a little bit about democracy, and I'm just going to say that I think we are suffering from the failure of democracy in this country and in the United States and in several parts of Europe. And this is a dangerous time. If I'm not going to suggest it's going the way that it went in 1932-33 in Europe, but for an older guy like me, it's looking horribly familiar. I think we need to be very, very careful, because if you go back to 1932-33 in Germany, there are no Germans who believed what actually happened would transpire. It's a slippery process, and already we're seeing the breakdown in the democratic system. I'm going to say, who controls the media? It's a very small number of extraordinarily wealthy people. Once again, it's big money controlling the media. And do people follow the media? Well, I've spoken to the editor of the Daily Mail when he was running an anti-vaccination campaign, and he said nobody listens to what the Daily Mail says. Now, he knows that's nonsense. He's not just selling copy, he's influencing people. And so I think the danger is that we have allowed a very small percentage of our population, to acquire enormous wealth, and a very large proportion of our population in the 6th wealthiest country in the world still on the streets. So I think we have a broken democracy, and we need to think about that. In a way, that's a sub-issue, but it is important because everyone can see there's something wrong. And in the 1930s in Europe, everyone saw something wrong, and there was a polarization. And that polarization doesn't always end in the right place.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we have run out of time. All I would say from all of that is choose your gods very, very carefully.